Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, 5 considerations for building or buying enterprise software. First, some notes. Everyone is on mute today. The presentation is being recorded, so a replay link and a copy of the slides will be emailed after the webinar. The webinar is hosted today by Brett Cooper and Richard Makerson. Richard is the CEO of Bluefletch and has been in technology and mobility for nearly 2 decades and a sought-after resource for media and speaking. Brett is the founding partner of Bluefletch and also has been in the tech and mobility industry for over 20 years with companies like Coca-Cola and Accenture. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Brett and Richard.
Today I'm joined by Richard Makerson, and we are going to be talking about buy versus build when it comes to enterprise software, specifically around mobility, which is where we focus on. Richard, I know this is something we've done a lot. We started out this company about 15 years ago, building custom software for iOS, Android, Windows CE. And, there's a lot of lessons we've learned along the way of seeing what companies do right, what they do wrong. And then we have a product now that fills some needs around security and single sign-on. And I think that we do have a lot of customers that still look to compare, our tool versus building it themselves. So there's some lessons we've found that in there too. But for you, when you think about the buy versus build, I know we came up with 5 topics, but is there something that really, like a great example of where you've seen this go wrong in the past with partners or companies we work with?
Yes, and it's usually around a big RFP process, especially when you have big other consulting companies around. There are clients we've worked for where we've delivered custom solutions that have been tailored for them, delivered on time, on budget, and they're exactly what they've wanted. And then you get into an RFP with a new team, and now you have an Accenture or Deloitte or an IBM in there, and they're saying, well, we can customize this thing that's off the shelf, or bring in this thing that's off the shelf and it's highly configurable, and, we're this big company and you can trust us. And, they just didn't have the experience of, being on the ground, understanding those systems and knowing that although it sounds great and looks great on paper, it's actually going to be very tough to implement.
Yes, I think the first point we called out was it sort of falls along that line, which is around customization. Mm-hmm. And when you consider buy versus build, the first piece of customization, the thing I always think about is SAP. It's $1 million to buy, and then you buy it, and then you give it to your IT group. IT group has to go spend $2 million to actually customize it.
Yep.
And at that point in time, you're like, well, it might have been better, but nothing against SAP. I love SAP. It's got a lot of great tools, but also some companies don't necessarily use it the way it was built because they have other processes. So when you think about customization, what are factors you think about for how much to customize versus when it's just better to go build from scratch?
Yeah. So you want to try to draw this virtual line in the sand around how are you going to support it long term? So am I customizing it so much that any future updates, if they change the product, or maybe SAP might acquire some new company and integrate it, how long is it going to take me to bring in that integration? So like that's probably where my mind starts to go. And then understanding my team. So what type of resources do I have internally? Do I have a team that could build something from scratch? Could my team support something long term, meaning that I just need an outside firm like Bluefletch to come in, be the catalyst, but my team can own and drive things long term, but I have a partner who can help me along the way. So it's just really a balancing act, thinking about just the long term impact, not just the short term, exactly how much it's going to cost, because that's not necessarily apples to apples all the time.
Yeah, it's a good point. And then the other thing I think about customization too, certain apps or services are designed specifically for customization. I think you mentioned Twilio as one we're a big fan of, and they do a great job. And there's other things I've seen out there where the client will buy it and say, we want to customize this. And we look at it, it has no APIs. You have to work with their dev team to actually get them to open up APIs, which is, it's a long and arduous process to get somebody else to change their core product for you. And in those situations, I feel like that would be better. What are the things in addition to Twilio? Are the other things you can think of that you like that have really good API services?
I'm sure I could name a ton. I know a lot of like the bigger cloud companies, as they acquire or as they grow and add more services, all of those, when you think about what Google has done over the years, Azure, and some of the other big cloud providers, everything's API based. They're meant to be the foundation. They're not necessarily meant to be the core product.
Yeah, I feel like Salesforce did a good job of that. Even SAP has done a good job of building APIs around a lot of their pieces in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. Salesforce would be a really good call out there.
Yeah. Number 2 on our list of considerations for buy versus build was time to market. Mm-hmm. Like when you think of the trade-offs of time to market, I know a lot of the stuff just goes back, and I think you talked about the price, and we'll get back to that later, but when you think of time to market, how do you think about framing that when you're having a client or a customer that's looking at building versus buying?
Yep. You want to think about the constraints around time to market. Is it just around a business case, meaning that I need to hit a holiday season or a certain time of year? Is it regulatory? There's a lot of customers that we work with that are trying to meet laws or constraints put on them. Or is it just meeting an internal goal, meaning that the whole company is now moving from one big product to another. And so, time to market is making sure that, we're not the cog in this big wheel that's trying to move the whole company in a certain direction. And so I think all of those have like different aspects and different things you can get away with, meaning that if it's regulatory, maybe it's okay to start out with something that's off the shelf. Let's check the checkbox, but we can always go back and revisit because we don't want to deal with any regulatory agency either shutting us down or fining us. If it's a business case, maybe you want to be stealthy. So maybe spending the extra money is worth it because the upside is so much bigger. And, being able to release something and knowing that it's yours, it's proprietary to you, it's a business advantage to have that. And then, not trying to be the cog in a big wheel as far as an organizational change. There's ebbs and flows. Sometimes you could get away with spending a little bit more time because you can find time in other areas. Usually there are very long multi-phase rollouts, and depending on how things are moving, you can move things around. So it just really depends on the problem that you're trying to solve and the constraints around that problem.
I think you sort of alluded to this. The other thing too I always think about is POCs, like getting something out to a small group, especially with everything going to consumption-based licensing, where you pay for how many users you're on it. So you can actually pilot a piece of software at a set of warehouses or a set of stores without having to go build something, and then you can actually learn from that if you want to go build it. And that's, for me, in the POC mindset, it really makes sense to look at some of these off-the-shelf products.
Yep, we got one customer now that we are trying to convince of that fact, right? They're trying to have a pretty big transformational change across the organization, and we're trying to convince them that, you already have the tools needed to test some of these ideas. And before you buy or make this very large investment or this decision that's going to send you down this rabbit hole, POC it, let's test, let's see what works, what doesn't work, let's get some feedback, because that may change or sway the bigger transformational decision.
Yeah, get those learnings out there. You mentioned this word earlier, but support was number 3 on our list. So the support and maintenance is, there's a lot of factors involved there. And I think what you alluded to earlier was, do you have to stand up a team internally to go, if you have bugs or issues, go fix that? What does that actually cost? And all these really go back to the business case. But for you, when you think about the trade-offs of supporting it internally versus having another company support it, what are the things that come to mind there?
Yep. So for me, it's how close is it to your core business, right? So early on, with our product, there are a few customers that have, bespoke versions of the launcher. And at the time, it was probably best of breed, best of market. And, that organization, either because of culture or decision, it's like, we're going to own this long term. And, it's not necessarily core to their business. It's core for their business, but not core to their business. So some of the updates or some of the thoughts or some of the learnings that a team that would have done this day in and day out would have put back into that product or put back into that solution is not there. And so when you get behind the 8 ball, you're going to stay behind that until you invest to catch up. And so, that's big to me. And so if you're going to have a team that has to, grow as far as their capabilities specifically to support this, and it's not necessarily core to your business, it's not what's setting you apart in the marketplace, maybe it's a thought of, are there tools out there, are there companies out there where that's their entire focus, where we can continuously be best of breed, we can keep up with the Android updates, if we're having issues, if we're having product ideas, we can have a conversation with that company. That's the biggest thing there for me. And the other piece is, if we do build this and it's great and I have the team here, will those resources, will that knowledge stay around? What is that going to cost me long term?
The one guy that knows how it's built.
Right. It's going to stay here, forever, to make sure that, if we have any issues with it, that it can be fixed efficiently, and it's not going to take down a core part or all of my business until we got, through that problem.
Yeah. And I think the moving forward is another expensive thing. You mentioned the Android versions. I know Google has changed a lot in the last 6 years, and our team is constantly making updates and patches on our stuff. We have some clients that decided to build their own, and they can't move to Android 11 or Android 13 just because scope storage broke everything the way they built it. So certain things like that, definitely there could be a big piece you got to pay for down the road. You touched a little bit on core to the business. Our number 4 was intellectual property. And this is one of these where I think you and I talked about the Uber example. What does Uber actually build versus what do they buy?
Yep.
What are your thoughts around intellectual property and what makes sense to actually go have IP around versus getting something off the shelf?
Yeah. A company like Uber, it was very disruptive. They had something, it was new, it was different, and IP was going to be important for them just because, in the marketplace, and probably because part of their business strategy was around, we're going to be attacked, from a legal perspective, either from other cab companies, municipalities. So we need to be able to protect ourselves, not only in court and in the marketplace, but for, most of our customers, the technology is around, their business process. So it's more of trade secret would be the right term, versus, a piece of IP or technology that's only focused to them. And so I think when, our customers who have more of an open mind and understand that, make those build versus buy decisions a little bit better, because they understand that, one, we can POC this, we can test a little bit. 2, we don't have to think that we're the only people in the world having these thoughts and these conversations at this point in time. And 3, if, I'm not going to be disrupting a whole business category or segment. I'm just wanting to differentiate or take more market share. Then there's, a balance to be struck. So, there are customers that we have where maybe the inverse is something that they're thinking about, right? Where I have a big SAP or maybe a warehouse management system or a mobile MDM that we're rolling out, and now we want to build our own. And so now we're taking the lessons that we've have learned from using this product for 5, 10, 15, 20 years to build our own. What is that going to mean for, the marketplace or my relationship with those vendors?
I do love when I go into companies and they have a WMS they custom built 25 years ago.
Oh, goodness.
It's still running the business.
Yeah.
But yeah. The big downside there is that, the extensibility around APIs, when you go with an off the shelf solution, you do, like you said earlier, start getting some of those APIs and other things that are out there. But yeah, so the theme there is if it's core and there's not 3 solutions out there already, potentially look at building it. But if it's what is it? If you're looking to build QuickBooks, just buy QuickBooks.
Just buy QuickBooks, right? If you need Workday, just get Workday. You don't necessarily need to build an HR system or CRM or something that is not necessarily core to your business.
Yeah, there's 10 options out there. You probably shouldn't go build it. It's not going to be your own intellectual property. And the last one, which we've touched on, it probably touches all the other 4 areas we covered. But number 5 was cost. Mm-hmm. And there's so many factors involved, around the productivity, value, maintenance, support. If you had to prioritize cost and how you do the business analysis, what are the key factors? You had to pick 3 or 4 key factors for cost as you look at buy versus build.
Yeah, cost for me is lower on the totem pole, although I know when making the decision, it's usually the big flashy thing that people pay the most attention to, that it feels like leadership that'll be the first thing they pick apart. But, oftentimes it could present false positives, right? There are a number of opportunities that we've, rightfully lost because we just cost too much initially. And if I had, a nickel for every time, somebody in leadership of that company, came back to me a year or 2 years after those decisions and said, you know what, we should have went with you, or this project was a nightmare, or, you guys were right, we, just made a bad decision. It's usually because cost is at the forefront of that decision. And especially when we're talking about the initial cost, there are very few customers that we've worked with that do a really good job of taking a step back and saying, okay, this is the initial cost, but what's the day 2 cost? And then what does this look like 4 or 5 years from now? And letting that help them lead the decision. But, to build it from scratch is, almost 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 times more expensive to get anything off the shelf. But then when you customize things, that's a rabbit hole that could go, out of control. Like your example around SAP, maybe cost $1 million, but could be $2 or $3 million to customize. And then for every version that comes out, you got to update those customizations. And so
bring the consultants back.
Yeah. And so, it's $2 or $3 million every version you want to go up. And sometimes it gets even more expensive versus, okay, we're going to have something that's highly customized to our existing business processes in our organization, that, we're going to think about support up front. Who's going to support it? Is it going to be our team long term? Do we have those resources? Do we need to hire those resources? Do we keep a company like Blue Fletch or any other companies on long term? What are those costs? Factoring in time of market, right? Like, what are our constraints? Do we have any? Do we not have any? And then making a decision. But I would say that the chasm or gap between, building something custom and taking something either off the shelf or customizing something off the shelf is closing. I don't think it will never necessarily come together, but the tools are getting better. The patterns, your ability to scaffold projects are becoming a lot better. And if you're an organization that has a history of doing POCs, of being able to iterate, you're also able to use those tools to help close the gap as far as time to market, or at least closing that cost chasm between buy versus build.
So with cost, I guess the big thing is, and I think you said this in there, but the value is different than price.
Yes.
Is a really good way to look at it. And I think that, what you said, the 5 years, think about something as a 5-year investment as opposed to what is it going to cost us this quarter. I know for a lot of public companies, it's definitely hard because they're looking at, what is my numbers this quarter, or what's my number, the next 4 quarters, as opposed to, 48, 60 quarters from now, which seems like a long time, or 60 months. So in summary, I'll cover these. So the first one was customization. I think the key points you talked about there is like understanding, can you get something off the shelf that you don't have to spend a lot of time customizing, or allows for that? Definitely consider the cost of customizations if a product doesn't have the APIs, things you need. Number 2 was time to market. And this is really the, if I need it for either regulatory or I need to, get it out there to increase productivity right now. Look at the buy things off the shelf. You can always like buy something, especially with cloud software, buy it, POC it, understand how it works, and then build your own later on once you have a better understanding. Number 3 was support and maintenance. So really understand, this really goes back to that long-term value, a 5-year or longer case study. Understand how long it's going to cost you to support something, either that's that you're building custom versus buying something that's a off-the-shelf piece. Intellectual property. Don't rebuild QuickBooks or
please don't,
or an HR system if it's not core to your business. And then the last one is cost, which is really think about the business case over a number of years. Think about the value and working through that. So anything else? Any other key summary points you missed there?
No, and I would just say with these points, if you're a manager, senior manager making this decision, like it's okay to push this up against your leadership. There's a lot of times where, we're arming, our customers to go back to leadership and, push on these points. Usually they want to take a directive and run with it. But, in today's day and age, speed, time to market, and then having something that's a great experience, can be a big factor in the success of your business. So, use these points to, try to make a difference and make an impact.
Awesome. Richard, thank you again.
Thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com or on our website below. Have a great rest of your day.